lecture, and it's my pleasure to do the introduction. We have with us Mr. Doug Garofalo. He is the president of Garofalo Architects and associate professor of architecture at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He is also a facilitator at ArchiWork Design Laboratory in Chicago. Garofalo has a Master of Architecture from Yale University, received in 1987, and a Bachelor's of Architecture from the University of Notre Dame. Lately, Garofalo has focused on using digital design, according to a sort of a recent article in Chicago Magazine. He was also picked as one of Chicago's best architects. That was the article's name. So we are extremely happy to have him here. He was just sharing with me that also he has been sort of pressured, of course, by the dean to take on the charge of assuming interim director of the School of Architecture at Illinois, Chicago. So we're absolutely thrilled that you came, and please join me in giving Doug a Ball State welcome.
Yeah, I can hear it. It's working. I've never given a lecture where I wore two mics. I have to believe that there's going to be some kind of spark that's going to do something to my heart during the lecture. Actually, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I was trying to remember at dinner. I'm pretty sure, I know I applied to Ball State back in 1975 for the 1976 year. I'm pretty sure I didn't get accepted. And, you know, looking around the facilities the last half hour, I just have to say it publicly, you all are extremely fortunate. I'm sure you have great teachers, although I couldn't see that except in the work, but the facilities are amazing. If any of you want to see what it's like in beautiful Chicago, we have the great city, but, you know, in terms of facilities, I'm just so jealous of what you have here based on what I've seen in just a little bit of time. That's really ringing. Is that bothering you guys, or? Mic here. That's terrible. Can you folks in the back hear me? No. Okay. Yeah. Just take this off. Hello? You hear me? Is this on now? Can you hear me in the back? That's a little better. So this is going to be great. All these little gadgets up here and a microphone to hold. Okay. What I wanted to do tonight, as Michelle mentioned, we're recently really trying to exploit digital technologies, but I don't, you know, as much as we're getting a lot of press for it, I don't really define our work entirely on that. However, I do want to talk a little bit about how digital media in general is, I think, changing practice. But the way I want to do it is just, I have a relatively young practice. It's only 12 years I've really been working for myself with my own work anyway. I mean, I was licensed before that, working for other firms. But what I want to do is maybe show you through the work some changes, I think, that are occurring. It's very much, the title of the lecture, Chicago Works, is also a play on some things. There's a city, one of the city departments, I forget which, maybe it's the Department of Cultural Affairs, or maybe it's, it could be any number of them, has a sort of patented thing that's called Chicago Works. And it stems from this idea that Chicago is the city that works. And my reason for kind of adopting that as a title, obviously, I mean, pretty much all my work, all the work I'll show tonight, with the exception of the church in New York, is in Chicago. But it's also kind of a pun in a way. If I were in Chicago, I wouldn't necessarily have to explain this to you. I could just say that it also refers to a famous critique by our architecture critic, and this occurred about 3 or 4 years ago. He wrote an article about how Chicago had lost its edge. Chicago was in the tank. You know, it really didn't have good design anymore. And of course, it really irked myself as a young practitioner, and probably at least half a dozen other young firms that I know who are out there, I think, doing great work. If you go to a place like SOM, maybe they are a little bit past their prime. So again, the title of the lecture, Chicago Works, is meant to kind of project the idea that there is other things going on in Chicago than what the press thinks is going on in Chicago. So I'm going to start actually with built work, but I'm going to go quickly into work that's not built yet. Has some aspects of building within it, a prototype newsstand, for instance. But I'm going to do this because I'm in favor of talking about ideas, speculating on what architecture can be and how the discipline, I think, is changing. Also because the built work, frankly, it takes at least 2 years to get anything built, you know, so the projects that are built are already 2-3 years in the past, and the work has changed. So this will become clear as we go along. Now let's see, the left slide thing is the right button. This will be great. Wish me luck. No. There we go. Okay. I cannot tell if those are focused or not, so it's okay if you want to holler out. My practice, actually, this one on the left, I guess I got to do it. It's one too far. No light up here. Excellent. Okay. Again, the city that works is supposedly kind of in a building slump, if you listen to our local critic. At the same time that there's been all kinds of change in the discipline, and my own initial, there's many things, you know, we're all, I think, very much rejuvenated and, you know, thinking again about sustainability, for instance. Digital media has really changed the way practice is how it transpires, actually, and and I would submit even how we conceive things. There's all kinds of things out there or issues out there that are changing what architecture is. In my own case, I started 12 years ago with houses, and I moved to Chicago. I'm not from there originally, because I thought it was possible to build there and to teach there, both of which I've done in the last 12, 15 years. But a huge surprise to me was that most of our initial work was in that place that I think maybe not you here, but certainly in my education, and in architects' educations in general, we're taught to kind of loathe the dreaded suburbs, right? What could possibly be great about the suburbs? I mean, remember, this is 12, 15 years ago. I think the suburbs is probably more accepted as a kind of a context to deal with now than it was 12, 15 years ago. But my first projects came in the suburbs, and they were suburban houses where we were given something that we had to keep. They're all pretty low budget things. But, you know, clients who didn't really have an issue with the style of the house, meaning they didn't want to necessarily hold on to, in the case of the slide on your right, anything remotely related to that little Cape Cod box that they had. And so we were asked in a project like this to completely reconfigure that box, to double the size of the house, to really radically reconfigure it. Well, you would think, yeah, tear it down. I mean, if somebody doesn't, if they're not really interested in it as a style, or, you know, have no love for it as a thing, what's worth saving? Well, again, remember, low budget projects. We were really stretching the envelope, as it were. relative to the budget, relative to technology. These all tend to be wood frame constructions, synthetic stucco, a lot of things on the interior that we built ourselves. We went through a string of about 8 of these houses in succession. I just want to dive into this one, which is a later one. It's gotten a little bit of press, but again, it's a design that is 3-4 years old at this point. I'll just go into this one a little more so you can get a sense of the kind of work that we were doing in these contexts. You know, the more I say we, by the way, that is anything from myself to up to 8 people in my office. We fluctuate sometimes pretty wildly, but I say we also because I never consider this just me. I mean, the first house was just me, but after that, you know, we try and collaborate in the office. So, you know, the more we heard about the suburbs or thought about the suburbs as this place that was so homogeneous, the more we realized this is not true. So all the houses actually really start to talk about ideas of difference at many, many different scales. You know, at the local scale, we were after projects that exhibited as singular things a great deal of heterogeneity, meaning, for example, you know, no 2 faces of the house would even look alike. No 2 rooms that were added onto the structure would be the same shape. Everything would have its own characteristics, its own set of characteristics, but somehow still in a family, you know. Sometimes we thought it was a pretty dysfunctional family of forms. Other times, you know, we tried to make things go together. The other thing about this particular project, it was at the time we already had started designing when computers kind of entered into our office, which is another reason I'm focusing on it. And we still make hand drawing sketches. We sort of draw on anything that's nearby, with the exception of drawing right on a computer screen. We use computers as sketching tools. We'll make models. We still do that. But for this particular house, we started to get some computers in the office and sort of almost have parallel design tracks within the office and trying to look at the house in a different way given the new tools. And something we got really interested in, I had the good fortune to assist Sanford Quinter in a studio up at UIC, and he introduced me to this idea of the epigenetic landscape. These are diagrams you're looking at, and they're diagrams really about probability, and scientists use them for a number of different things. The one on the right, the probability comes in, if you look at the slide on the right, what's the probability of the ball when it rolls down this topography going to the right or left of that ridge, right? If you roll the ball down 100 times, maybe 80 times it's going to go to the left and 20 times to the right. And so that's a mathematical model. Try not to think of it as form so much. The form is just in the interest of illustrating a point. Now look at the slide on the left and understand that if that is a view from underneath that topography, that if you touched any one of those wires, think of a tent, that topography would change, right? One touch of any wire would actually affect the entire topography and thereby affect how the ball is rolling down that topography, right? Now think of those wires as if they're genes, okay? And we all have a kind of formula of genes that give us the shape of our bodies, you know, the color of our eyes, so on and so forth. All those things determine characteristics. So you can imagine the complexity here. Obviously, there's, you know, with the advent of chaos theory, there's been all kinds of work in this arena about complexity theory, and that, you know, that the machines can actually handle the kind of calculation needed to maybe think about form in a completely new way, whether you're talking about facial structure or some other reasonable application of that kind of model of probability. For us, it became a convenient way, you know, as we were starting to use computers and trying to really think critically about their power, the calculation power, the calculus of the machines, if you will. It became a way to really think about inside and outside. And it also became a way to think about these ideas of heterogeneity we had in the suburbs. Again, this traditionally so-called homogeneous place. So in a sense, we started thinking about the roof in this particular project. Imagine, or you can see as I flip through the slides, a whole series of kind of disparately formed rooms, different colors, and they're all kind of loosely arrayed around each other. But the roof, which you can start to see in these, the roof and the truss system that holds up the roof actually is kind of a skin that draws all this together again. And we were really trying to walk this line between, is the thing falling apart or is it cohesively put together? I mean, we really wanted both. So, difference in repetition and cohesiveness. That, again, this is all at the local scale of the house. Now, you can gather from the slide on the right that the two gables are probably not something we did. Those were existing in the house. Once we started to think of this idea of the epigenetic landscape or the epigenetic field, the idea that everything's connected, we sort of thought of the roof as a topography. And therefore, there weren't just two gables. We thought of gabling as a kind of a verb, if you will, and we could cause that to have a ripple effect across the rest of the house, the rest of the new pieces. And really, in the end, also maybe think about the context of the surrounding neighborhood. I'll show you one of the last slides. Well, I don't know if it makes it clear or not, but I can at least try and illustrate it. So you can see the slide on your right shows that roof. I'm standing on one of the gables, and you can see how the roof is really conceived to start to wrap up over all the new stuff, to get this idea of cohesion across. What you can't see in the sort of middle of that slide on the left edge is the house next door, which is a gabled house. When the leaves are off the trees, you can kind of get a sense that, oh yeah, this folding roof actually sort of works with the context. If you take all of suburbia and you think of gables, and you did a little map of gables on one block, you'd find all sorts of angles and twists and turns. And that's how we were thinking of the roof of this house. Some shots of the inside, and the one on your right, you can see that truss system. The trusses are actually all the same, but no two of them are set at the same height, the same angle and plan, etc. And so there's this idea of standardizing the fabrication from the steelworker's point of view, but then once it gets in the field, it gets set on top of, within the framing to get this idea of the epigenetic roofscape together. Some other shots. So that's I guess I don't have that last shot showing context. What I would have said about it is, the house, for as different as it looks, if you start thinking about the roof as a system of gables and trying to connect those folds and angles to the neighboring houses, it actually works. I mean, you can actually, we've been able to convince ourselves that we're sort of strange contextualists, if you will, based on some of these ideas. This is another remodeling project, the Korean church, and it's gotten a lot of press. It was a collaboration with Greg Lynn and Michael McInturf. Greg's in Los Angeles now. He was in New Jersey when we did this, and Michael's in Cincinnati. And we collaborated over the internet quite a bit. We traveled a lot too, make no mistake about that. But we did a lot of this over the internet just using a simple email program attaching drawings. Again, even 7 years ago, this is relatively new to us, the idea that you could transfer files. There's no way that any one of our offices could have handled this job. It's a $10 million job in a place that none of us lived. We all had small offices of 3 people at the time. There's no way we could have done it, but somehow, very simply, we figured out that we could do it collaboratively using the internet. Now, as I said, it got a lot of press. The slide on the right is definitely not my idea of the future. And, it's at those points when you start to understand that the hype can get a little too far and kind of miss the point. I mean, the building, I think, is formally interesting. Equally interesting to me, though, is how, personally, it was an extension of some of the house projects as a remodeling project, a giant one, I'll grant you that. I didn't mention on those houses, a lot of our clients have been first-generation immigrants, you know, incredibly interesting people, not, again, what you expect to find when you go out to the suburbs. I'm a product of the suburbs myself. And with this particular project, which is in a way in a suburb of New York, it's in Queens, it's a Korean Presbyterian church. There's a kind of a collage for you right there. They buy an old laundry factory, which has had a life as a makeup manufacturing plant, was abandoned, and they want to turn it into a church. Although not just a church, it's got to be a community center. Holds 2,500 people per service. After the services, they go down to the next floor into a cafeteria that seats 1,000, and they serve Korean food. There's 80 classrooms. There's a library. There's about 40 offices. There's 4 multi-purpose rooms, and there's a gallery, and there's a daycare center. So it's like a miniature city. It's not so easy to just refer to it as a church. So again, this idea that the program is really complex, heterogeneous, if you will, something to pick up on. On your right is the original framing plan of the building, which, if you look down this diagonal, that's the frontage, that's the main street, the front of the building, where the offices would have been of the Knickerbocker Laundry back in the 20s. You can very easily, I've seen your typological studies in the school up in the halls. Anybody out there knows that, you know, what you have at the top of that slide is the big shed-like structure, the manufacturing floor, if you will, where all the laundry equipment and ironing machines were. You can see in that framing plan exactly how the building works. You get an office bay on that diagonal. You get the big work area. And then you get this kind of mess of framing in between that isn't really resolved very well. When you look at our plan, we actually took that kind of messy area as the area that we would, in fact, remove part of the building for the purposes of sliding in these circulatory tubes, as we called them. So I guess my point here is that we looked really, really closely at the existing building. We didn't just, in a cavalier way, land this stuff on the roof because we were, you know, so lost in the computers with the blob software. That's not actually, that may be what gets the press, but it's not actually very accurate in terms of how the project was made. Again, you see this idea on the right that none of the faces of the building look exactly alike. They're kind of relatives of each other. You can see the way the site plan works. The diagonal is the Long Island Railroad. In between the railroad and that diagonal face of the building is the main street, the public face. But the congregants come to the left of our building into that parking lot and enter the building in the slide from left to right on that tube, or through that whole circulatory system of tubes that stick out into the parking lot. Essentially, we had to go from there and get up onto what was the roof of the existing building, because that's where we put the new sanctuary. And you can see to the right of the slide on the left that kind of big illuminated square and that system of ramps and stairways that snakes out into the parking lot. We think of that as an outdoor room. It's, you know, full of people on a Sunday. This slide on the right, well, we could call it a lot of things. Tonight I'll just call it exactly 40% of the exiting for the sanctuary, which could be outdoors. When you start working on larger buildings and start to deal with mundane things like exiting and indoor space that has to be, by code, enclosed outside of an assembly space, that 40% is really valuable to not have to put completely indoors in heat. So, you know, obviously it's not just 40% of exiting. We tried to make an issue of how that connected back to the sanctuary. Those shell-like structures that, allow it to meet code and be covered. It had to be covered, but it didn't have to be enclosed. And you're inside of them on the slide on the right. Those continue inside the building. I hope to have an interior. You'll see an interior in a minute. Hold that slide in your mind. They go inside and form the sanctuary on the roof. You can see on the right the tubes. We used an animation program to kind of animate those tubes into the kind of weak points of the building, and you can see how sometimes they come out the other end and form a really tall, dramatic space. And the only kind of iconography are steel I-beams at the ends of a couple of those. There's that long outdoor space on the slide on the left. The slide on the right just to show you that, yes, we did make a physical model. It's never been published, but we actually made lots of them. You can see inside on the slide on the left the spaces, where the circulation tubes come in. You're outside the sanctuary, and this is the slide I wanted to have before. That metal skin folds inside and bifurcates once, and it's all drywall essentially, and it has a light cove. So when the congregants are looking down at the service, that light is not in their eyes. It just sort of makes everything kind of float. Now, that shows you that light cove on the left, and on the right is, the idea that the animated snapshot of the series of forms that were put on the roof and then set in motion and played with to kind of get the ribbing, if you will, that forms the sanctuary. But we had a lot of back and forth with the clients, honestly, in terms of the meetings and this idea of symmetry, non-symmetry. I mean, they came in and said, we want this aisle right down the middle, and, we're dealing with this incredibly complex existing building and new set of shapes. Before I switch over to the more speculative stuff, I wanted to just show you one other completely different thing. This is a competition we won, and I'm showing it now because a lot of the things I'll show you that aren't built yet are competitions, which we do a lot of. Not actually just to win, just to kind of keep ourselves fresh and to have this unbridled thinking that probably many of you don't realize you have right now in school, but you'll realize at some point in the future. This is a competition we won for the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. It's a 6,000 square foot space. It's an exhibit design. And the collection is for timepieces. The city of Chicago, or we taxpayers in Illinois, bought one of the best collections of timepieces in the world. The mayor bought it. And they held a competition to design the exhibit for it. And, it was really appealing to us to go after this one as much as we could because, again, I started talking about how we were trying to employ the certain aspects of digital media in our work. Well, this all of a sudden became a chance to think about aspects of time. And we do use a lot of animation software. And this, was my favorite time in the office in the last couple of years was when we were researching for this particular project, and then we pulled out Stephen Hawking and Albert Einstein, and that's what we would read at night, and we're on the computers or we're drawing all day long and talking about theories of special relativity and space-time continuums. We really had a blast with it. The curators had said to us, said to all the competitors, we want you to, ideally, we'd like a visitor to come to this exhibit and, come away with some understanding of Einstein's theory of special relativity. I can tell you every architect in the room, kind of squirmed and laughed when they said that. Our idea for that was to make sure that they wouldn't exhibit the timepieces chronologically, meaning that they wouldn't just set up, the oldest pieces in the beginning and the later pieces at the end. To us, it meant we had to always associate all the timepieces with each other. At the same time that we had to respect some of the thematic categories that they had. We did the whole thing without using one sheet of drywall. We developed a wall system that was made out of recycled plastic and steel, and all the timepieces are set in vitrines, plexiglass vitrines inside that are set into that wall, and so that you can start to see through the walls, through the slots in the walls. The recycled plastic to us made a lot of sense relative to issues of sustainability. Those have to be relative to time. The idea that the material used for the walls used to be detergent bottles in this case was a great contrast in our minds with, a stopwatch that's, as big as your hand that's worth $5 million from the 17th century or something like that. To sort of juxtapose these different ideas of time, collapse them right together. There's a lot going on in the space. Michelle, you could turn on the computer thing now. There's a lot going on in the space. It's going to be up for a couple of years if anyone's interested in seeing it. The other thing I'll mention as the computer is going to come up here soon is that one of the ideas of the wall system was that there were 1,600 pieces. There are 1,600 pieces in the collection, and they told us that even though it was a year in advance, that by the time the show opened, January 1st, 2001, they still would not have everything completely unpacked or put together. So a very, very complex show to curate. So one of the ideas of the wall system was also to allow them over time, in fact, to continually insert more plexiglass boxes with more watches in them. It's such a great collection. We're still kind of after them to make sure that every single piece is out in the museum. I don't know if many of you know it or not, but most museums, have not even close to their full contents on display at any given time. And our idea was, well, let's create a system which over time would allow the entire collection to be displayed. Okay, we're going to, again, that particular project, it'll become clear, a couple of these projects I'm going to show that weren't built actually helped us generate the idea for that wall system. And I guess my main point here is to, particularly in lecturing at a school, is to convey to you how ideas, architectural ideas, whether you win or not, whether you build or not, can kind of carry over time, and they end up in other projects. It's not a matter of doing the same thing all the time. It's a matter of having concepts that you're interested in pursuing, and letting form go a little bit in favor of trying to pursue some ideas. So the first thing I want to talk about is a competition that was put on by the Architectural Club of Chicago some 4 years ago. And it was, I love these sorts of competitions where, the proverbial visions competition. What that means is you don't get a program. And you just think of whatever you want to think of and submit it in 4 boards or whatever they tell you to do. So this was no different. The Architectural Club of Chicago, a group that meets periodically and does lectures and debates, sponsored it. And all they said was, it was per this thing I said at the beginning of the lecture, Chicago has lost its edge. This is the thesis, I'm paraphrasing. Chicago has lost its edge. Why doesn't the Chicago Architectural Club sponsor a competition that's visionary to show, all these ideas in Chicago? Our take on that, I worked with a group of people in my office. Our take on that was, to go against the Burnham plan, or to go against what the Burnham plan called for. Not so much the Burnham plan, but what Daniel Burnham called for, which, this famous line of his, make no little plans. Actually, we wanted to make lots of little plans. We had it in our head that what we would do instead of, seeing the city in a big way and thinking ourselves as arrogant master planners, we would prefer to make a series of small projects that would have a ripple effect in the city. They were totally cerebral. These aren't sort of real constructions. We could make them real. I mean, we think we're capable, but that wasn't the point of these. The point of these was to make a series of works that would cause one to think about how the city is used and what kinds of things could be in the city and what sort of thing could you put in the city that would actually grow. We actually thought of them as fertilizer in a way. This one, for instance, that slides under Lakeshore Drive at the lake was meant to be a big clearinghouse for technology. I mean, one of the issues of technology is it's great if you have access to it. So this was meant to be a public sort of warehouse for technology. Another one was a park that went from horizontal to vertical, and something that would have intense amounts of structure, but no leasable space. So it's a big space frame, and all those little chunks you see in it are, in fact, reading rooms that might be wired. So anybody in the city could come to this, go up into one of these rooms and read a book. It's kind of like a techno park, if you will. No plants, just, overt structure. Kind of an anti-developer mentality, if you will. All this effort just aimed at the public is what we were after. This is we as you can see, we did a series of collages and plan for each miniature project, and then we did a series of photo montages to kind of put it in context in the particular area of Chicago we were working. Another one was at the base of Marina Towers by Bertrand Goldberg, a much-loved building all over the world. But unfortunately, if you know this project, you know that there used to be a theater space that was affectionately called the Whale. It's all covered with sheet lead, and Dan Aykroyd and company have put the House of Blues there, which I think is great. I mean, we're all for preserving the blues, but they really did some just butt ugly additions to this thing. I don't know how else to put it. They're just really, it's hard for us as architects to imagine this great idea of trying to conserve the blues in Chicago, giving it a place with some money behind it, some backing, but then, taking one of the most important monuments and tacking on these really stupid postmodern towers onto this thing. Our idea was to maybe think of at the river, and these are abstract, they're sketches, think of them as sketches, a series of music shells, smaller practice spaces for street musicians. To contextualize this, what was going on in Chicago at the time is street musicians were sort of being summarily kicked off the streets and asked to register because there were complaints about how loud the noise was downtown, and so we thought, well, let's do something that anyone could use if they wanted to practice music. This final one was taking Navy Pier and taking another look at it. Navy Pier is one of those commercial success stories in Chicago, but one of those aesthetic nightmares for architects. It's really, I mean, no one likes the look of it. It seems to be popular with tourists. I mean, I go out there occasionally. As was said about the Eiffel Tower when it was built, although there's no comparison here, it's the best place to be because then you don't have to look at it when you're out there. We wanted to do something with Navy Pier that would talk about public space, and there isn't time to sort of go into, I guess, all the readings. I don't know if any of you have heard of Gregory Ulmer down at Florida. He's worked with Jacques Derrida and Peter Eisman on some projects. He teaches literary criticism. He wrote this amazing essay called Electronic Monumentality, and he talks about how a new kind of a monument could be made using digital media, And his idea is that, you know, the most perfect kind of public space is the space of mourning. It's the only time that people get together and actually act as a community. I mean, actually, September 11th, I think, in a way, starts to prove that out a little bit. So our idea was to make the cemetery, turn the pier into a cemetery, but turn it into a different kind of a cemetery where the actual plots are up in the air and they're public objects. So we have these things that are bladder-like that would float above a landscape. You'd go up into them from underneath, and there'd be one for each ward in the city. So you could bring a picture of a loved one, you could have it scanned in, and that picture would be projected on the inside of this bladder. And those things, because they'd be somehow a rubber or membrane, Teflon membrane or something, that they would actually move in the wind. No two of them would be alike, and there'd be this kind of fluttering, really lively sculpture garden that actually meant something to people. You know, you weren't going out there to buy the McDonald's hamburger at the Navy Pier McDonald's. Something a little more important, if we could be so bold about it. So, you know, we did another one where there was a series of homeless shelters that were on Lower Wacker Drive, which is being all rebuilt. And this was, you know, because of that awful story years ago where somebody went by with a high-powered bow and arrow and, you know, killed somebody down there who was sleeping in a cardboard box. And the city's response to that was to put up fences down there so people couldn't sleep. So obviously there's a lot of there's enough cynicism in these projects, enough critical inquiry, if you will, inquiry, excuse me, a sense of, you know, not agreeing with the status quo, the kind of politics of, you know, what public space was. Oh, excuse me. I have to go back here. And again, the idea was to make some critical commentary on the city and not think that architecture could answer all those ills, but also not to just think of projects, you know, that would be constructed as if, you know, none of this stuff ever happened. But we actually won the competition, which means I think it was a $1,000 prize or something. You know, there was never any intent to get anything built, and so what we did is we went out to dinner and we made sure we spent everything. Now, you know, the projects, we did some writing with the projects. I've skipped through them pretty quickly, but, you know, that, as kooky or critical or negative as those may seem to you, those 5 or 6 projects, they actually spawned a whole bunch of things in the office that happened later on, such as this project, which is a housing project, temporary shelter. We were asked to think about this problem for a gallery in New York, and we just, you know, we went out, found a site in our neighborhood, a marginal site near the L tracks, dreamed up a program for temporary shelter, which I'll explain in a minute, and made a project, made a speculative project, and tried to, once again, work in the use of the computer somehow. I'm going to go through this a little bit, and I'm going to have to cut away, show you an animation just to illustrate this idea of the animation software. Essentially what you're looking at is a bird's eye of an institution. The 3 troughs you see are landscape. So it has a roof garden. It's a 3-story building. Third story is a roof garden. The second story is a series of SROs, single-room occupancies, which are kind of being phased out in Chicago. They're exactly what they sound like. And the first floor would be where all the public services are. And the idea of the building really is that the population is what's transient. The building is the thing that's permanent. And so we were very, very interested in this idea of permanence and transience. And what I'll do, you're looking at a series of diagrams which were taken from the animation, which I'm going to show you right now. So just bear with me. I'll get this thing going. And this should start right up. So here's the site. And you can kind of see that that diagonal street is Lincoln Avenue. The one going up and down is the L tracks, the elevated train. And what's going to happen, you're looking at the modules, the gray and yellow modules are the size of two SROs put together, sharing a common space. We kind of gridded out the site with those, and then what we did, we oriented them to Lincoln Avenue. And then what we did is, as we animated those up in space, think of this as a grid rotation project, really. We started to orient them more towards the L tracks, which are up in the air. So I know a lot of you are using animation software out there. Pretty simple animation. We took a series of snapshots. And our reason for this was to try and generate the volume of the building, to make the skin of the building really kind of, again, this idea of cohesiveness, to take all the disparate parts of the building and hold them together. So what happens is when you sort of generate the volume that way and then skin it with a surface, a NURB surface, you get this kind of rippling effect, which we liked very much. And since we've rotated those up in space, you also get the roof of the building being a lot more open than the base of the building, the first floor of the building. And so the light kind of drops in there. And so you can kind of see that as we pan back out here. That was, in essence, the simple animation part of it. Here's where you have to bear with me. I refuse to use the PowerPoint presentation. This is a free slide thing, but you got to allow me to zip through these again. The other thing about the project, besides the animation software, is we were interested in a particular kind of landscape form in Illinois and Iowa, and I don't think it's in Indiana. It's called a Luss landform, a German word, and it refers to loose, crumbly sand. And if you've ever seen these things, they're really beautiful. They look like sculpted rock. They look really solid, but in fact, they're very, very transient. I mean, you could, if your eye could actually catch it, you know, these formations, land formations, change on a daily basis. So we went as far as this. I mean, we only intended to ever make this schematic. It's probably to date still one of the more popular projects in the office. I mean, every client who comes in and sees some of these renderings says, "What is that? Why don't you build that thing?" You know, I've shown it in public many times in Chicago, and people want to see it built. So, I mean, we were only, again, trying to think of this problem of homelessness, thinking about a new institution, trying to use the animation software, again, coming out of those first sort of quintet of projects. But all that led up to this other project as well, which is we were asked to participate in a show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and the name of the show was Material Evidence. Maybe some of you saw it. Cynthia Davidson of Any Magazine guest curated it. There were initially 4 young architects that were asked to think of materiality and to think, you know, Cynthia's idea was that the only way to talk about what's going on in the world amongst all these disparate ideas of what architecture is, the only thing uniting them what seemed to her to be an interest in new materials. So the 2 things she said to us: do something with materiality, you know, think about materiality as an issue in contemporary work, and to that end, I want you to build something full scale in the museum. And so she said street furniture, and we picked a newsstand. Now, they gave us $3,000 to do all that, which meant we had to go out and get lots of donations from suppliers and fabricators. So we actually built this one ourselves. It really started by this idea from that first competition I told you about, the idea that you could put in the city a lot of small things to generate maybe other kinds of projects. Our idea of the newsstand is that we wanted to come up with a system. We didn't want to design one sculptural object. We wanted to design a system that could be deployed throughout the city It could exist live in the computer, so whenever we got a site, we could adjust it to its site, and it could be fabricated through some pretty advanced kind of milling procedures. That was the materiality part for us. So we decided we'd make one model. And thinking about the newsstand, we thought a newsstand is about information, sure, newspapers, but what about a newsstand as a place that projects information outward? You know, performers, street performers again, that, you know, our friends that are getting kicked off the street in Chicago. What if they had a space like this where music could be thought of as information? How could we make it sensitive to people walking by so people wouldn't necessarily just annoy it? So this is kind of a section. You can see the car there to the left. It consists of the initial sketch, and this is actually a composite of a computer drawing and a hand drawing. You know, a shell that would protect from the street, a kind of a counter console thing, and surfaces to hang stuff on. I'm really skipping ahead. There's not time to go into every kind of thing we thought about, but if you look at this thing in cross-section, you can understand it almost as a roll, you know, like a holiday roll that you know, it's your mom or your dad, if your dad bakes, you know, rolls up dough and frosting and fruit all together, and you get this consistency. That's how we thought of the material. And the materials we used were zinc as kind of an old material that's finding new uses these days. Recycled plastic, that's the orange stuff, and the kind of green stuff there is just quarter-inch sheet steel. All the ribs are aluminum. We thought of the console as something that could be wired with, I think, I've been through your computer labs. I think you all know what a MIDI device is, something that would sense movement and transmit it as light or sound. So the idea was when people would walk through this newsstand on the sidewalk, whether they bought anything or not, whether somebody was performing there or not, you know, they might trigger some sensors and be part of this public symphony, if you will. Again, we thought of not one, but many. And it could be a series of spaces that artists could have for a month at a time in the summer. You know, we haven't lost our cynicism either here. This is right on the heels of the fiberglass cow thing that took place in Chicago. I think many of you know about this. The city had made 500 fiberglass cows. They gave them to artists to, quote, decorate, and they were put all over the sidewalks, and very successful, kind of fun. But again, as somebody who knows a lot of artists in Chicago, without a place to perform, I mean, I and we in my office are concerned that cows will become the definition of public art, which is, it's just not good enough. It's a good tourist thing, but it's not good enough to be passed off as art in a city like Chicago. So we really thought of this not just as a newsstand. We thought of it as a public space where things could be enacted, where everybody would engage it just by virtue of walking through it. So you're looking at, this would be the view if you were standing on the street. That's zinc, the zinc panels. There's 100 panels. They were all directly cut from a computer file in about a half a day. As I said, we built this. I personally folded all those panels in a half a day. We had a welder working with us. Well, we were working in his shop. We recycled all that aluminum and that black quarter-inch steel from another project and put it all together. And when it was in the MCA actually had a Saturday where they do this periodically. They just invite performance artists in to the museum and let them perform. And this is Ben Nicholson. Some of you may know. He teaches at IIT. Fantastic architect in the city of Chicago, and he does a lot of writing, and he has written a lot about Chicago, and he chose this space to read some of that on a Sunday afternoon. And a performance group also came in and looked at the piece and said, you know, wow, this is a big musical instrument. So they spent 2 hours beating on this thing, and we had tensile cables and everything, and these are some really pretty well thought of avant-garde musicians in Chicago, actually from around the world. And we filmed this whole thing. It was quite amazing, and they beat the hell out of it, actually. It was quite, the sound coming out of it was quite amazing. So again, this notion of a small thing that might do a lot more than one would think, and something that could be deployed in all sorts of places on the street. And maybe it's a newsstand, maybe it's selling tacos. It doesn't matter. It's the idea that it could adapt to those sites and to those programs. So that project actually did get built, if you will, at least as a prototype. It's been shown at Yale. The whole thing comes apart, and we can ship it. And we've put it up at Yale, and we've had it at the MCA. Would need a lot more engineering to be out in the street. But again, the idea from those initial competitions into this newsstand. This is more recent. You might have read about this. It's the Chicago Housing Authority National Endowment for the Arts competition for one of the awful housing sites in Chicago, the Abla Housing District. Big site. They gave us one block to think about, we really wanted to think about this idea of heterogeneity again. How can you build in difference, or call it personality, if you will, into a project that has to be really repetitive, really pretty economic in terms of building. They required that this be built for $115 a square foot, something all the architects said was impossible. So how to get this idea of difference and heterogeneity or character into the project at the same time you meet requirements like that. This had to be 1/3 market rate, 1/3 affordable, and 1/3 assisted. To this day, I know this is state-of-the-art in housing. I know it is, but it's hard for me to this day to understand how we could make an instant community like that, to sort of force it. And I wonder, just because it's not a tower, which are being ripped down in Chicago, if low-rise is going to be salvation, as if I don't believe actually that architecture can completely emancipate people from their position in society. Certainly we can make a better place to live. There's no doubt in my mind. Make a great place to live. Our idea here was to not distinguish between, well, it was actually a requirement to not distinguish between units on the outside. The CHA's idea on the inside is, well, you'd start cutting the corners on finishes, or the assisted housing, the HUD stuff, would maybe not get washers and dryers. We just refused to do any of that. We thought, look, we're going to make a housing project. We're going to make it quite diverse so that it'll accommodate a lot of different sorts of people as much as we could. And, if we win, we'll have to fight the battle about equal housing for all. The scheme really is a sectional scheme. You're looking at a plan here. You would access those from stairs in between the units below. And the whole thing is made to be this kind of weave of units where light is dropped in, where people can see each other, and something very taboo in Chicago, actually, to suggest that, yes, you can have coach houses, units that are above garages off the alley. So there's no front and back to us. It's all front. It's all courtyard. It's all landscape. Over on the right, because we just couldn't help ourselves, tower units. Just because, again, we don't believe that towers are the problem in the end. And this is just showing the different unit types. In the middle is, those single-story units. They would be done with precast panels laid down horizontally. We've had a little bit of experience with that. The undulating stuff that slides across them at roughly 90 degrees is a system of brick panels, and then the towers are metal. And this is the effect we were after. You know, community garden there to the right. You know, you look down through courtyards, all kinds of decks and things. We got an honorable mention. Brian Healy from Boston won the competition. It's kind of grim, actually. Not Brian's scheme is quite good. It's grim. The developer Habitat has sort of privately said, it's out in the grapevine in Chicago, that they prefer not to use any of the schemes and, you know, pick their own architect. So that's a little depressing. But this would have been the view from the street. So that undulating brick facade would kind of go in and out, and it would fissure at certain times to reflect the change in topography. And views inside some of those courts. Lastly, I feel like I'm running a little over time, so I'll go through this a little bit quickly, but this is the latest. We did this in exactly 4 days, this competition. That's pretty much all we had. It's for the Chicago Office of Tourism. You can see Michigan Avenue, the big kind of rectangular building. Bottom right is the Cultural Center. There's a little 3-story bank building to the north there, behind the container building, that triangulated one to the right, that tower. And the Chicago Office of Tourism and the Department of Tourism, it's 2 separate departments, currently have their offices in the Cultural Center. They want to remodel this building for their offices. And, you know, obviously tourism is big business these days. And what they asked for was a facade redesign and a first floor plan. And we were pre-selected along with 10 other younger architects. And it took me, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks. I emailed back and forth with these people, said, what's the program? I mean, they gave us a 2-page document talking about innovative architecture, and we said, what's the program? And after 2 or 3 weeks of trying, I get back an email that says, there'll be 2 or 3 people working there. And that's all we got. So we went further, and we started, again, thinking about public space for the building. We developed a whole set of components for the building. I mean, our first take on this is what do tourists need, right? They need information. They also need probably to go to the bathroom, which is very hard to do in a contemporary American city. So we thought, well, we should have public restrooms, and then we should turn the whole building into a place that projects information. Again, think of the newsstand I talked about. So we don't want to just have the 2 or 3 people working behind a counter giving information or handing you a brochure. We want to have a whole series of components that would project information, televisual surfaces where you could watch the news, places to plug in to check your email, to make a phone call, to get cash, to go to the bathroom. A roof garden, because on the roof of this building you'll be able to get the most incredible view across Michigan to Frank Gehry's band shell. So we thought of the roof as a really prime location for receptions, public receptions. And because the mayor is, our mayor, a great thing he's done is he's planted just hundreds of thousands of trees and is trying to get a green roof program off the ground in Chicago. And so we wanted to populate the roof. The plan is very simple. To your left is Randolph. And it's strange, there's an alley that runs along the bottom of this plan between this tower, I guess it's about a 40-story tower, and this 3-story building. And that's where we wanted to put the restrooms, off that corner. These are self-cleaning restrooms. We had to price all this, by the way, even though we weren't given a budget. And when we called the manufacturer of these, French manufacturer of these restrooms, Deco is the name, they said, where are you going to put this? And we said, Chicago. And they said, oh, don't do it. You can't do it. You're going to lose the competition because the mayor, we're about to get the contract for the newsstands and the vending things on the sidewalks, and we tried to get the mayor to be interested in public restrooms, and no way. He's just totally against them. We put the restrooms in anyway because, again, part of this is making a statement about what should be there, not just trying to figure out what the mayor wants. We thought of the sidewalk coming right into the building, and you know, obviously we have the counter and everything where you can vend the brochures. The facade actually is this, you know, a modular thing where we could actually design the curvilinear glass. Great company out in California, C-Tech. They used to do automobile glass. They were about to quit the business, and then they ran into Frank Gehry to do the Condé Nast project, and they got all rejuvenated. They have all these great computerized milling machines that they'll make molds for you and slump glass into it, and so you can develop your own prototype, which is what we want to do. And again, the idea that the building would open up to the street, you know, you could watch the news there, you could go inside for directions, you could sit and read the paper, etc. Yeah, and this is just one take on what that glass facade might be. Finally, on the side off the alley, we've had experience collaborating with an artist who's using billboard material to do her art and hanging it on buildings, and we thought, well, you know, let's turn the building, part of the building, into a canvas for artists that could change periodically. So that's our scheme. That's my lecture. Wish me luck. We present to the city. We're a finalist tomorrow night at 6, and we'll see if in a couple of years you might be able to walk into this. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Doug. I wonder if you'd be willing to take a few
Sure.
questions.
Of course. The name of my firm? Garofalo Architects. That's the easiest question I've ever had in public. Thanks.